Roughly 1 in 5 people in America live with some form of disability that impacts their everyday life. These individuals have not always had the access to opportunities and rights that are present in today's society, as the American government once did not deem it necessary for them to take responsibility for protecting their rights. The Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, was signed into law in 1990 to create equal opportunities and improve the quality of life for those with disabilities. The ADA was created after a long-fought battle between disabled Americans and the government, as the United States has had a long history of public laws that serve to the detriment of the disabled. Though there are still struggles present today, the Americans with Disabilities Act was ultimately a historic and vital piece of legislation that addressed previous inequalities and furthered the civil rights of disabled individuals, not only at home but also abroad. It further set the precedent that the government was responsible for protecting the rights of all of its people, backing the idea that everyone in the United States has the right to equal opportunity.
Prior to the passage of the ADA, discrimination towards disabled people was rampant across the United States. These practices dated back to the mid-19th century with the enforcement of ugly laws across the country, which prevented disabled people from appearing in public. These laws stripped disabled citizens of their rights, as people in public spaces, such as vendors and performers, were no longer allowed to earn an income. Even after the dissolution of these laws, disabled people were still discriminated against in everyday life. In most places across the country, public and private buildings were inaccessible, sidewalks could not be accessed without assistance, and those with disabilities were denied an education or jobs because they were deemed a safety hazard or incapable of performing tasks. One prominent activist for disabled rights, Judy Heumann, attested to these challenges as she discusses her early life living with a disability caused by polio. Over the years, I have faced discrimination because of my disability. I was denied the right to go to school when I was 5 because I was a fire hazard. I lived in Brooklyn, but could not ride a bus or train because they were not physically accessible. I was denied my first major job as a teacher because I couldn't walk. When I was 18 years old, I went to vote. However, I couldn't go by myself because our polling place was up 4 steps. These examples of discrimination, along with the success of other social campaigns of the time, like the Civil Rights Movement, inspired the idea that meaningful change could be achieved and would eventually spark the disability civil rights movement.
Following World War I, the United States began to pass legislation that helped protect the rights of those disabled in the war. A particularly notable piece of disability rights legislation from this time period was the Social Security Act of 1935, which provided benefits to blind and physically disabled individuals. One of the most significant pieces of disability rights legislation to be passed was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This was the first law that prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability from federally funded programs. However, much of the controversy surrounding Section 504 came from the fact that the regulations for how to implement this law had not yet been published. While the legislation had passed during the Nixon administration, the regulations for it were not signed until President Carter was halfway through his 4-year term. Disability rights activists took issue with the lack of urgency the Carter administration had in signing the regulations. This led to a month-long sit-in in April of 1977 at health, education, and welfare offices across the country, in which disabled activists urged Secretary Joseph Califano to sign the regulations or resign. Eventually, after a long-fought battle, Califano would meet the demands of the protesters. The idea of creating a disability civil rights bill originated in the 1980s. As demands from activists grew stronger, the government slowly began to look into the inequalities that existed in society. Many of these inequalities were brought to light by the Toward Independence Report, which showed how many public programs were serving disabled individuals and also provided details on how a comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation should be drafted.
The first draft of the American with Disabilities Act was introduced in 1988 by Representative Tony Coelho and Senator Lowell Weicker. While the legislation was popular in both the House and the Senate, there were concerns regarding costs for small businesses, potential lawsuits, and religious objections to certain groups being protected under the bill. One of the main reasons as to why it took so long for the ADA to pass was due to lobbying from public transportation companies such as Greyhound, which argued that it would cost a great amount of money to upgrade all their buses. Congressman Tom DeLay was one of many who opposed the ADA and argued the wording would lead to lawsuits regarding a lack of compliance, saying that business owners just want to know how to comply with the bill. Mary Reed, a lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Businesses, also argued that the renovation cost to update a bathroom or to widen a doorway could easily bankrupt small businesses. By 1990, the ADA had passed through the Senate but was still stalled in the House. There was controversy regarding what would go into the final bill. Disabled activists were outraged, as they had been given little information on the progress of the bill. This eventually led to the Capitol Crawl, a protest in which disabled activists took themselves out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the stairs of the Capitol to demonstrate the harm inaccessibility was causing in their lives. Ultimately, this protest was one of the main reasons as to why the ADA was able to finally make it to President Bush's desk. On July 13, 1990, the ADA passed in the Senate with a vote of 91-6, making it one of the most favored bills to pass in the Senate in United States history.
After a long process of negotiations, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26, 1990. To this day, the ADA is the most comprehensive piece of disability rights legislation to have ever been passed in the United States, and it has greatly reduced the inequalities disabled individuals face in our country. Immediately following the passage of the ADA, many of the anti-discrimination policies took effect across the country. However, many of the changes and plans outlined by the bill didn't immediately go into effect.
I'd say the immediate effects were more of those policy changes, like the anti-discrimination in hiring, a policy of person discriminating. Those went into effect much quicker because you were just controlling for people's behavior. Whereas, as you kind of mentioned, like building compliance, construction compliance, buses, all of that naturally took longer because you had to develop architectural guidelines, for example, of, okay, if we say the building has to be accessible, what does that mean, right? Like, I can't just say, make your presentation accessible or you'll go to jail, right? That's not what would happen. But like, I have to tell you what that means, right? I have to give you like the rubric, the regulations to follow. So those types of things took longer.
The Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act of 2008 was passed to help expand the definition of what qualified as a disability under the ADA. Prior to this act, courts were left to interpret the definition of what a disability was, leading to a lack of protection for many when they truly needed it. As a result, more individuals were able to seek protection under the original law, which made the ADA more effective in serving its intended purpose. Ultimately, the Americans with Disabilities Act was one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. This step towards equal rights for disabled citizens allowed for more access to public buildings and transportation, more job opportunities, and more social acceptance in the country. The biggest impacts that can be seen as a result of the ADA are its accessibility features. All public infrastructure, such as sidewalks, are required to meet the ADA standards for accessible design. Without the ADA, disabled individuals likely would not have equal rights in the private sector, as many previous disability civil rights bills only protected against discrimination at the federal level. The Americans with Disabilities Act also inspired disability civil rights legislation globally, such as the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was ratified by 191 states.
While the ADA has been a monumental bill, there's still much work to be done. Many of the issues regarding the ADA come from enforcement, since individuals are responsible for filing lawsuits, which can often be costly and time-consuming. Some older buildings are also not required to be made accessible due to their age, which keeps unnecessary barriers in our society. Additionally, many small towns use these older buildings and churches as voting centers for their residents, which often prevent disabled citizens from exercising their right to vote due to inaccessibility. While the ADA has had an impact on protecting disability civil rights and expanding accessibility, it still has a long way to go in terms of fully protecting America's disabled population. The United States government has a responsibility to ensure the rights of every citizen are protected, and more comprehensive efforts are needed across the nation to achieve equal rights for disabled individuals. Regardless, the Americans with Disabilities Act was a monumental piece of legislation that greatly expanded the rights of disabled citizens, setting a global precedent that one has the right to participate in society regardless of their physical and mental abilities.